Thank you, John, and thanks to McNally Jackson and the New York Institute of Humanities and to Francine and Phil and Boris and all of you in virtual attendance for coming, for being here, whatever here may be. When we conceived of this event was supposed to take place at NYU in the middle of March. We sort of intensified the title of the event. It used to be Writing from Dark Places, and it was one of a series of events that, together with the New York Institute of Humanities, we were going to do to mark the 20th anniversary of the NYRB Classics series, and we wanted to bring out different kinds of writing that we've published over those 20 years. And it has to be said that from Euripides' Trojan Women to Dante's Inferno to C.V. Wedgwood's The 30 Years' War to Alistair Horn's History of the Algerian Revolution to Schreber's Memoirs of My Nervous Breakdown and the domestic novels of Ivy Compton Burnett, we have a lot of books which look at different kinds of dark spaces, historical, interior, and what you will. And when we planned it, I suppose we were thinking, I mean, these darknesses in some sense always with us, but we certainly didn't imagine that we would be, well, at first not meeting and now meeting virtually at a time when, to quote the first of the writers, we're going to look at Teffi and her memories of 1918, where an event in that book where she gets stopped at a borderline and the people say by German border officers, because she's in German-occupied Ukraine right after the Russian Revolution, and they say, you've got to quarantine for 2 weeks. Nobody imagined that would be the case. Or indeed in Teffi, there's the wonderful line that a joke isn't that funny when you find out you're living in the middle of one. It starts to feel a lot more like a tragedy. So we're going to start with, the general plan is for each of our participants to read a passage from the writers they'll be talking about. We're going to start with Boris talking about Teffi and go on to Phil and talk about Grossman, and finally Francine talking about Dezső, Kosztolányi, if my Hungarian is somewhere on target. And I'll have a few questions, and then at the end we will throw open, we'll take your questions. But Boris, why don't you kick off well, let me say a few words about this book, Memories. Teffi is a Russian writer who lived between, I can't remember the date of birth, but it's sometime in the latter.
72.
72, and she lives to 52, right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And quite a star. And Memories is a book about, she performed in public as well as writing widely. And Memories, which she wrote in the late 20s, recounts her, she didn't expect, well, basically her departure from her native Russia. She's in Moscow right after the revolution. Famine has set in, terror is about to set in. She gets an invitation, or rather an impresario in Moscow arranges for her to be invited down to Kiev, which is actually under German control at this point. And so she's sort of on a lark with another actor, an actor and an actress, says, sure, I'll go. And one thing leads to the other. In the course of roughly a year, I think a little less than a year, she ends up sort of rolling down, as she keeps saying, the map of Russia, going first to Kiev, and then as Kiev falls to nationalist Ukrainian forces and the Germans are defeated in the First World War, she then moves to Odessa, where there's a port, hoping to go beyond that, and then to Sebastopol. And the book at the end finally finds her leaving Russia for Constantinople, a Russia that she will never ever return to. So it's about going through a brutal civil war, several different civil wars really at the same time, and and also it's actually about literary evenings like this one, because that's what she's basically going down to Kiev to do, is to give a public reading event. But I'll turn it over to you at this point, Boris.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for that, Edwin. It's a beautiful introduction and very succinct. I don't have much to add to contextualize the book, but I will say that I've cheated a little bit. I've chosen two passages to read, one very short. They still won't fill 5 minutes, so I'll just get going. Both of these passages find Teffi aboard a ship called the Shilka, which is in a terrible state of repair and very poorly supplied. And she doesn't know whether it will reach its destination. And it's the proverbial ship of lost souls. Many refugees fleeing the Bolsheviks who are advancing on Odessa. This is 1919. So the first scene concerns her activities on the ship. That morning, Smolyaninov came to see me. He was in charge of various administrative tasks on our ship. In his previous life, he may have worked for the New Age journal, though I don't know for sure. I have to tell you, he said, that some of the passengers are unhappy that you didn't join in yesterday when they were gutting fish. They're saying you're work shy and that you're being granted unfair privileges. You must find a way to show that you're willing to work. All right, I'm quite willing to show my willingness. But I really don't know what to suggest. I can hardly have you scrub the deck. Ah, scrubbing the deck, my childhood dream. As a child, I had once seen a sailor hosing the deck with a large hose, while another sailor scrubbed away with a stiff, long-handled brush with bristles cut at an angle. I had thought at the time that nothing in the world could be jollier. Since then, I've learned about many things that are jollier, but that stiff, oddly shaped brush, those rapid, powerful splashes as the water hit the white planks, and the sailor's brisk efficiency, the one doing the scrubbing kept repeating, hup, hup, had all stayed in my memory. A wonderful, joyous picture. There I had stood, a little girl with blue eyes and blonde pigtails, watching the sailor's game with reverence and envy, upset that fate would never allow me such joy. But kind fate had taken pity on that poor little girl. It had tormented her for a long time, but it never forgot her wish. It staged a war and a revolution. It turned the whole world upside down, and now, at last, it had found an opportunity to thrust a long-handled brush into the girl's hands and send her up on deck. So that's Teffi making the most of the revolution. And just a few pages later, we find another scene. She's on deck again, alone. And from the saloon below come snatches of song, little snippets of song. But she's alone in the middle of the night. The Shilka creaked and swayed. A black wave crashed dully against her side, then bounced back. It shattered the rhythm of the song. It was alien to the small, cheerful light shining out from the saloon into the dark night. The wave had its own deep and awful life. It had its own power and will about which we knew nothing. Not seeing or understanding us, not knowing us at all, it could lift us, drag us, hurl us about. It was elemental. It could destroy. A large star blazed like a bonfire. Like a small moon, it cast a path of broken gold across the sea. That's Sirius, said a voice close by. A young boy, a stoker. White against his sooty face, his eyes were gazing intently into the sky. His shirt was caked brown with dirt. Through its open collar, I could see a bronze cross on a grimy string. That's Sirius. You know the stars, I asked? He faltered. A little. I'm a sailor, a stoker. When you're at sea, you often have to look into the sky. From the boiler room? He looked around. Yes, I'm one of the stokers. Don't you believe me? I looked at him. What reason was there not to believe him? Broken black fingernails, that bronze cross. Of course I believe you. Black waves with white fin-like crests were rolling along beside us, lazily vicious, thumping and slapping the hull. Sirius's golden path faded away. It began to drizzle. I moved back from the rail. Nadyezhda Alexandrovna, the stoker said quietly. I stopped. How do you know who I am? He looked around again and said, still more quietly, I visited you in your apartment in Basseinaya Street. A student friend of mine, Sebastianov, introduced me to you. Do you remember? We talked about stones, about a yellow sapphire. Yes, it's coming back to me now. Nobody on board knows who I am, not even in the boiler room. This is my third time at sea, my third voyage. My people are all dead. My father's gone into hiding. He told me I must never forget, not even for a minute, that I am a stoker. Only then will I be able to survive and carry out the task I've been entrusted with. This is my third voyage and I have to return to Odessa. But the Bolsheviks will soon be well entrenched there. And that's why I have to go back there. I started speaking to you because I was certain you'd recognize me. I trust you. I even suspect you're just pretending and that you didn't recognize me, so as not to alarm me. Is my disguise really that good? It's remarkable. Even now I feel certain that you really are a stoker and that what you've just said is only a joke. He smiled. Thank you. He bent down, quickly kissed my hand, and darted toward the ladder. A small spot of soot was left on the back of my hand. Yes, Petersburg, evenings, languid, high-strung ladies, sophisticated young men, a table adorned with white lilac, a conversation about a yellow sapphire, a slender boy who spoke with a slight lisp. What was it he'd said about a yellow sapphire? How many more journeys would he make with his bronze cross and its grimy string? 1, 2, and then he would rest his weary shoulders against the stone wall of a black cellar and close his eyes. Only a small, dark spot of coal soot on the back of my hand. Nothing more.
Yeah, that's a beautiful passage in the book, and I mean, in some sense, all the things that make this book so so unusual, which is to say, both the sense of irony, the extraordinary eye for detail and telling detail, a humor against all odds, really, that is there, but finally also the real pathos are in a way there. One of the things that in that first section you read comes up all the time that adds to some of the humor is that she was really quite a celebrity. And so tell us a little bit about Teffi as a sort of figure in Russian literature and in Russia at that time.
Absolutely. I'll go all the way to the end to a prediction made by a poet who also lived out his life in emigration, a peer of hers, Georgy Ivanov, who said that Teffi the humorist is a very clever writer and a very skilled writer, wonderful, civilized, cultivated person. Now, serious Teffi, that's a miracle. That's a one-of-a-kind phenomenon in Russian literature. And he predicted that 100 years from the date of his prediction, people would be marveling at that serious Teffi. But what makes Teffi special, is, of course, is that there aren't two Teffis. There's one Teffi that holds those qualities in balance, which is why I chose those passages. One that I find very funny, and one that I can see the humorist succumbing to the moment. Mm-hmm. And one of the tragedies of her career is that she was, for the most part, in her early success was the success of a humorist. She wrote small, funny sketches for any number of periodicals and became an absolute bestseller. People often say that this is the only author that was beloved both of Lenin and Tsar Nicholas II. Yeah, and she really was. When it came time to celebrate the 300th anniversary of the Romanov dynasty, they wanted to publish a book of Russian writing and asked Nicholas whom he would include, and he said, Teffi, only Teffi, there's no need for anyone else. And Lenin, with whom she overlapped at a periodical, and whom she did not like at all, did not hold that against her. He loved her work. But the fact that people continued to laugh at her, even when she was deadly serious, was a pain to her, I think. I think now we're discovering that there are two Teffis, and that those two Teffis belong together in one career.
Yeah, I'm trying to remember who it was that said that, there's some writers who are murky and you can't see their depths, but the Teffi is transparent and you can't see to the bottom of her. Yes. Which is, I think, true. Well, why don't we probably turn now to Phil Klay and talk about Grossman, a very different kind of Russian writer, and so let's see. I'm not. Yep. There you are. Okay. Grossman. Well, Grossman here we're talking here about Stalingrad, and so. It's interesting. Stalingrad is the one at first of two novels that Grossman wrote about the Battle of Stalingrad. And in America, the second one, Life and Fate, was the first one to be published. And so Stalingrad, which actually had appeared in the Soviet Union under the socialist realist title, based on, I think, on a speech of Molotov's, For a Just Cause, but which is the first of the two books sequentially, has just come out in the last year. And this is basically, the two novels basically track the battle from its beginning in late August of 42 and to its end in 43, and with Stalingrad largely being devoted to the narrative of defeat that preceded the battle. So it's in a way a novel about a nation that had deemed itself great and powerful, but discovering that it is in fact completely overwhelmed by, in this case, a physical enemy. And it's a novel on epic scale and also an intimate scale, right? Because there's all sorts of, there's a huge cast of characters, and there is frontline stuff and backline stuff, and there is a slow rallying as it goes on to, as the battle, which in some sense was a last stand for the Soviet Union at this point. If they had not won, they might well have been defeated, or at least partially negotiated. And also a battle which was in a way the turning point of the Second World War. Anyway, I'll turn it to you, Phil, to read.
Yep. So I'll read a little bit from just a section towards the end. It doesn't really require much setup other than knowing that it's the Battle of Stalingrad. The gray sharp-edged tank had a broad sloping forehead adorned with a black cross. Somewhat jerkily, it mounted a low bank of bricks and came to a standstill as if to get its breath back and examine its surroundings. It was hard to believe that its cautious, mistrustful movements, the slow, silent rotation of its turret, the stirring of a predatory steel pupil in the eye of its machine gun port, were being directed by people. The tank seemed a living being, with its own eyes and brain, with claws and terrible jaws, with muscles that never tired. A fair-haired Soviet soldier was preparing with icy concentration to fire his anti-tank rifle. With an almost imperceptible slowness, he began to raise the butt. The barrel moved down and the backplate dug into his shoulder, which felt reassuring. He pressed his cheek to the cool butt and glimpsed to the V of the backsight the tank's low, sloping simian forehead powdered with a pink brick dust. Next, he saw the tank's closed rectangular hatch. Then the side armor came into view with its dotted line of bulging rivets, then the silvery caterpillar track and some splashes of oil. The ball of the soldier's index finger, till then barely touching the trigger, gently took the first pressure, and the trigger began to yield. There was sweat on the soldier's chest. He knew that he now had in his sights the most vulnerable part of the tank's steel hide. The tank began to move again, and the turret spun slowly around. As if sniffing out its prey, the gun turned smoothly towards the soldier lying behind the mound of bricks. Holding his breath, the soldier increased the pressure on the trigger. His weapon fired. The recoil was like a powerful punch to his shoulder and chest. He had put all his strength, all his passion into this shot, yet he missed. The tank shuddered as if belching, and white poisonous fire flashed from its gun. A shell exploded behind the soldier and to his right. The soldier opened the breech, inserted another black-nosed, armor-piercing cartridge, took aim, fired, and missed. A small dust cloud rose from a heap of stone a few meters away from the tank. The tank let off a round of machine gun fire, and a flock of iron birds tore harshly through the air, just above the soldier lying flat on the ground. In despair, drawing on his last reserves of emotional strength, the soldier reloaded and fired once more. A bright blue flame flashed across the tank's gray armor. The soldier lifted his head. Was he imagining it? Or had he truly seen a blue flower flare from the gray steel? But then he saw thin yellow smoke coming out of the hatch and turret, accompanied by cracks and rumbles. It sounded as if the machine gun cartridge belt were detonating inside the tank. All of a sudden, a flaming black cloud shot up from the tank, and there was a deafening explosion. For a moment, he felt unsure whether it was really he who had brought about the explosion, whether this black cloud really did have anything to do with that blue flame he had glimpsed on the tank's armor. Then he closed his eyes, bent his head to his rifle, and gave the barrel a long, slow kiss, feeling the blue steel with its smell of gunpowder against his lips and teeth. When he lifted his head again, the tank was still smoking. It had been blown apart by its ammunition. There was a gash in one side. The turret had slid down onto the tank's forehead, and the drooping gun now pointed toward the ground. Forgetting all danger, the soldier got to his feet and repeated in a loud, passionate whisper, "Me! Look, that was me!" He lay down again and called out to his neighbor, "Please, lend me another cartridge." Never, perhaps, in all his complex, motley, often less than honest life had he known such happiness. Today he was fighting not for himself, but for everyone, and the world that had deceived him so often, the world he had so often wanted to deceive, had ceased to exist. Death was nearby. He was confronting death in single combat. Zora, his number 2, had died already. Konankin, his battalion commander, had been killed by shrapnel a few minutes before the tanks attacked. His section leader was almost dead, too, crushed beneath a huge heap of brick, unable to give orders or even let out a groan. He was alone with only his gun. Who did he remember at this moment? Did his thoughts turn to his mother and father? This man had never known his mother and father. Before the revolution, they had lived in Petersburg, where his father had worked as a civilian official in the Admiralty. During the Civil War, his parents had tried to escape the country via Crimea, but they had both died of typhus at Melitopol railway station in southeastern Ukraine. Age 2, he had been taken to a children's home. He grew up knowing nothing of his past. Although once in the hostel of a school for future railway workers, he had a strange dream. He was standing on a slippery parquet floor, wearing a small lace-edged apron and holding in his hands the long, warm ears of a dog. The dog's clouded eyes were looking straight into his own, and its rough tongue was licking his cheek. A woman threw up her hands in horror and carried him away, pressing him against the slippery silk on her breast. While he kicked his legs and yelled, she wiped his cheeks with a warm sponge. He studied, then dropped his studies and got a job. He married, left his wife, left his job, went off his head and took to drink. One night he and 2 friends broke into a grocery store. They were arrested the next morning. The beginning of the war found him in a labor camp. He petitioned to be enlisted and was sent to the front, granted the opportunity to earn his pardon. Today he had destroyed an enemy tank and received a shrapnel wound in the leg. He knew he would now be pardoned. But that was not what he thought about as he saw a second tank moving forward between the ruined buildings. Calm, sure of his strength, and still rejoicing in his success, he began to take aim. He was confident of a second triumph, but before he could pull the trigger, he was hit by machine gun fire. Finding him still alive, with a fractured spine and his stomach gashed open, 2 orderlies dragged him away on a greatcoat.
Yeah. This is towards the end of the book, right, where which finds a sliver of Soviet soldiers on one side of the Volga, holding this little bit of terrain against the German advance.
Right.
And it really is a sort of fight to the death, but they hold the ground, right? And so
at tremendous losses, yes.
Yeah, and I mean, almost nobody. Well, they did in fact hold that ground, right, throughout the battle, and until in fact the Germans were encircled in that. But yes, the tremendous losses, and he doesn't. Though this is a sort of rousing passage, he doesn't minimize the losses at all. You might talk about Grossman's own role at Stalingrad, because this is this is an eyewitness account in many regards.
Yeah, and he was, he was there. He wrote dispatches about it. He had tried to sign up at the beginning of the war, though he was not in the kind of physical condition where it was likely that he would be successfully taking aim at German tanks. There's a sort of, one of the reasons that I wanted to read that particular passage is there's a sort of knock on this book, or a way of understanding this book in relationship to Life and Fate, which I think is wrong in important ways. So Life and Fate is much more critical of Stalinism and the Soviet Union, and draws direct parallels between the Soviet system and the Nazi system, right? Yeah. And this book, certainly does not do that to this extent. It was published while Stalin was still alive. Then it was denounced, and possible if Stalin had lived longer, Grossman would not have survived. But and so it sort of assumed that you'll often read people talking about this book, assuming that everything that he's writing that is sort of positive and rousing is, he's writing through gritted teeth, right? I think that's wrong, right? This was a guy who, later in life would, even when he was, being much more critical in his writing of the Soviet system, would, get his family up and have these like lusty emotional renditions of songs from the war, where he'd like stand as if he, at a soldier at parade with his face solemn and stern and sing, arise the huge country, arise for the mortal battle with the dark fascist horde, with the accursed horde. He always to the end of his life was a believer in the heroic aspects of what had been done, the import of what had been done by the Soviet people, despite the brutality of the war, despite the brutality of the system, despite the dehumanizing aspects of being at war and being in combat, which, he doesn't gloss over. The first character that you meet going off to war is this peasant who basically, just says, he saw the war as a catastrophe. He knew that war destroys life. A peasant leaving his village for the war does not dream of medals and glory. He knows he's probably on his way to die, right? That's the beginning. And yet, Grossman does not want to say that war is meaningless violence in this particular context, right? This is a guy who was one of the first people in Treblinka. He understood the necessity of fighting Nazism, and he was profoundly moved by some of the things that happened at the front and the heroism that he saw. He certainly does, he doesn't talk about, say, the 13,000 executions of people that happened at the Battle of Stalingrad to keep people fighting, right? And yet, in which he's sort of, there's a lot of savagery on the part of Soviet troops that he's much more honest about in his war notebooks, and yet nevertheless remained, in some ways, a believer in the importance of the sacrifice that these soldiers had been through. And so throughout the book, there are a lot of these, very beautiful little portraits like that one, where you get this very quick but vibrant portrait of a human being in this unbearable circumstance, for whom, the circumstance is terrible, but also meaningful, and, it just reminds me, I was talking with a friend of mine, the novelist Elliot Ackerman, who was in the Second Battle of Fallujah, 5 tours as a Marine, Silver Star, Bronze Star, Purple Heart. And he said to me, he said, when you talk to people about war, right, certainly in American context, if you say to them, well, do you want to talk about the good stuff or the bad stuff, right? He thinks most people would rather talk about the bad stuff, right? It's what, from a sort of literary perspective, right, that's what we're much more comfortable with. And Grossman, this novel is much more interested in how those things are shot through altogether. Yeah,
it's a big novel, and there are all sorts of different things going on. It's also, interestingly, it's a novel of family life, and it's a novel also of the natural world.
The passages on what the battle does to birds and rats and cats are just astounding. Brilliant. I was going to read the other section I thought of reading was this amazing portrait of Hitler, and he's meeting with Himmler, who's like precisely calibrated the right amount of obsequiousness that you needed to, and sort of the life in wartime Berlin. But then I thought, screw Hitler, right? Grossman would prefer that we focus on this anonymous guy who dies, who perhaps, his body is never found, and so officially the Soviets never consider him to have died in battle, because there were so many who disappeared, and they didn't know who was a deserter and who had died, and was never found. But that was the person that he was interested in.
Yeah, it's interesting that this novel, I think, paves its way. I talked about the relationship to life and fate, and people often seeing Life and Fate as the politically advanced novel in a way. But this novel, I think, very much paves the way, and that I think he sees that his optimistic take on the battle is that the Soviet Union, which had in the terror lost its path, so Grossman's family was a pro-revolutionary family, has in some sense found a new lease on life. And that having done that, though it was a tremendous struggle for him to get this novel published, it was blocked repeatedly. But once it was published, I think he went on to believe rather optimistically he could write the other novel, which would be fully critical of the Soviet Union.
Yeah, they refer to, people think of Life and Fate as his dissident novel. He's not considering himself a dissident when he's putting that out, right? Khrushchev has given the 1956 the secret speech where he, Stalin had essentially wanted to cast the war as being won by the system, right? Mm-hmm. It was the entire Soviet system sort of that had enabled the mines to be working and production to be sort of supplying things for the front, and then the frontline soldiers are one piece of that, right? Mm-hmm. And then and it was sort of all under Stalin's great leadership, right? And then Khrushchev essentially says, it's the whole Soviet nation that won the war, with a sort of major contribution from the military. And he sort of thought that with that kind of loosening of the narrative around the war, that Life and Fate would be something that maybe could sneak in. It's still a little crazy to think, given some of the things in Life and Fate that he thought that, but it's not that he is totally, it's not that, one is the dissident author and the other one is the one writing for the censor, right? Yeah. They're the same man at different stages in a progression, but sort of grappling with a lot of the questions and grappling with what is happening. What does it mean for the individuals? What does it mean in terms of our understanding of political ideologies, and the sort of systems that are constraining human beings, and then the potentials for freedom, because one of the things that was always kind of stuck with him and is very powerful in Life and Fate is the idea that it was in the trenches that people were actually able to be more free than in the Soviet system back home, because there was a certain degree of loosening up, because you just couldn't have the same sort of degree of control for a bunch of people at the front line.
I'm hoping that somebody will ask Boris later to talk about Grossman and Teffi, who are both, sort of intimate writers, even as they work at very different scales, or very personal writers in their way. But I think we should turn to Francine and Kosztolányi, Skylark, a very different book about basically the both comic and very, very dark about the darkness of ordinary life, set in a small town, written in 1923, set in a small town in what had been southern Hungary, but was, by the time he wrote it, actually Serbia, or Yugoslavia, excuse me, at that point. And so, in a way, a book written about a vanished world. It's set in 1899, and I don't think that's certainly not accidental. And it tells the story of a pair of parents in this small town who have one child whose age is only identified later, but she's basically, her nickname is Skylark. She is quite unattractive, and she is unmarried. And at the beginning of the book, she goes away, as she hasn't for many years, we're told, on a vacation to visit her uncle in another, at some distance by train, for a week. And everybody at the start of the book, the two parents, is confounded on what they are conceivably going to do for this week in which Skylark, who seems to sort of run their household, will move. So they are desolate. But then in the course of the book, they begin to reconnect with the rest of the town they live in, and to think again about the lives they and their daughter have led. But I'll turn it over to Francine now.
Well, it's a strange book to pick as a dark book, because there's no war and there's no bloodshed and nobody dies. And in fact, it's about love. It's about family love. But it's also about the prison of family life. And it seemed to me that, you know, every book that you love seems relevant at every moment that you're reading it. So when I reread it a couple of days ago, I thought, well, this is exactly what many people must be experiencing right now, which is, you know, being completely incarcerated with your own family who you adore, but nonetheless, there you are in prison. Anyway, Skylark has in fact gone to visit her uncle, and her parents, who really couldn't understand how they could possibly live without her, during her absence have just gone crazy, and they've gone out to the theater and they've enjoyed themselves because they've led a very contained and very modest, constricted life with Skylark. They've gone to restaurants, and one night in particular, the father, Anguish, gets wildly drunk and begins to just talk about, horrifyingly to everyone, what life with Skylark is really like and how she's their prisoner and their jailer. And it sort of settles down. And now the passage I'm going to read is from near the end of the novel. And Skylark is coming back from visiting her relatives, and she's coming back on the train, and her parents have gone to the station to meet her. "I can't see her," said Anguish. The woman made no reply. "If only to steady herself," she then said in an undertone, "perhaps she missed it and will come tomorrow." Had these doubts lasted a second longer, it would have been the end of them both. But far away in the darkness, with a wavering, almost duck-like waddle, a woman was approaching. She wore a black oilskin hat, not unlike a swimming cap, and a long, almost ankle-length, transparent, waterproof cape. In her hand, she held a cage. They stared at her blankly. Terrified of another disappointment, they didn't dare believe it was she. They didn't recognize the oilskin hat nor the waterproof caves. As for the cage which the woman held, who had no other luggage, swung in her right hand, and at times raised up to her chest, this they simply couldn't understand. The woman was hardly 4 or 5 paces from them when Mother glimpsed the outline of the porter behind her, carrying the brown canvas suitcase bulging at both sides. Then she saw the wicker travel basket too, bound with packing twine, and the flask, the water flask, and on the porter's shoulder, the white striped woolen blanket. Yes, yes, yes. She cried out frantically, "Skylark," and almost beside herself, rushed to embrace her daughter. Father let out the same cry, "Skylark," and he too held the girl in his arms. But while they were thus united, abandoning themselves entirely to their delight, a third voice called out too, farther off in the darkness, a derisive nasal echo, rather like a cat's meow, "Skylark." It was one of those mischievous urchins who for a couple of pennies would carry people's bags into town. He had witnessed the theatrical outburst from a freight wagon, and finding the scene thoroughly amusing, had imitated the poor couple's voices before quickly ducking out of view. All 3 of them woke with a start from the spontaneous joys of reunion. The smiles froze on their faces. Skylark strained her eyes toward the station building, but saw no one either on the platform or on the track. She thought she must have been mistaken and acted as if she hadn't heard. She walked on with her mother, who slipped her arm into hers. Anguish trudged along behind with the porter, but more than once he glanced toward the wagon, his eyes piercing the darkness. He recognized that voice. It sounded like all the others, only more brazen and blunt. At one point he even stopped and took a few steps into the night towards it. But he soon turned back. Instead, he swiped the air with his umbrella, dealing it an almighty blow, clearly meant for the inviolate youth. Then he caught up with the 2 women. Skylark was in fine spirits, witty and jovial. "My dear parents aren't even pleased to see me. Well, well, they don't even recognize their own daughter." "Of course we do," said Mother. "It's just that hat." "Doesn't it suit me?" "Yes, only it's so unfamiliar." "It is a bit on the tight side. It flattens my hair," she said, straightening her hair with her free hand. "It's from Aunt Atelka, the cape too, so that I shouldn't get drenched." It's a lovely cape, isn't it just?" "Yes, only it makes you different, so interesting, so independent." Aunt Atelka said so too. And this, oh yes, the cage. What is it? A pigeon. They reached the exit. Skylark again raised the cage to her heart, and while Akos handed her ticket to the inspector, who was more than ready to go home, she coddled and cosseted her darling bird. Tubi. He's called Tubika. I won't let anyone take my Tubika. I'm taking my Tubika home myself. Outside the station, Father wanted to flag down a hackney carriage, but Skylark caught his arm and wouldn't let him. The unnecessary expense. Besides, the walk would do them good after so much sitting. The porter could carry the luggage. Akos gave the man the umbrella. From beneath his heavy load, the porter kept peering back to see how far they had fallen behind. It was no longer raining, and the wind had died down. Only occasional drops shuddered down from the branches of the acacias by the side of the road. They ambled slowly on between rows of poplars. Skylark walked in the middle, Mother and Father on either side. Father carried the flask in which water still slopped to and fro, and the white striped woolen blanket. He gazed at the ground, lost in thought, and didn't hear a word his wife and daughter said.
That has all the things that make this such a wonderful novel. I actually had reread it. I was thinking today as I was rereading it just a month ago. That is to say, I reread it at the beginning of March when I had to talk about it at a class. But was noticing all sorts of details I don't remember at all. One of which is this sort of wonderful detail of their not recognizing their daughter, which is both a matter of how much they need her and how much they also are crushed by her predicament. But and then the father with his sort of, and her the father with his sort of chaplainesque swipe of the umbrella that takes it. Most of the book is seen through his eyes. He's really, in some sense, the central figure of this book. Skylark disappears at the beginning, comes back at the end, but most of the and so. Tell us a little bit more about Akos, because his sensibility in a curious way is the one that's being tried most throughout this.
Well, he had a life. He had friends, and he had a kind of eating club that he would go to, and they would go to the theater, and all these things one by one shut down because the parents and Skylark were so close. And also there's a guy in town who maybe or maybe not was a suitor of Skylark's at one point. Mm-hmm. And so every time Akos sees this guy, it's like a knife in his heart, because this is the guy that could have made their lives so different. But, I mean, it's funny you said you taught it, because I've taught this book twice, and both times we're in these classes. I was teaching classes in strange books, and I just picked like the 15 strangest books I could find, and this clearly was one of them. And some of the books were pretty dark. I mean, mm-hmm. We were doing Robert Walser and so on. And this was the one that terrified my students the most.
Really?
This was the one they said, no, this is too dark. I just can't do it. I don't even want, they hardly wanted to speak about it, because it was their terror, I think, that you could just go home and disappear into the town you came from and be with your parents again and never escape ever. And also it says something which is, it's very honest about, and no one likes to think about it, because in a way in our hearts we want to believe in certain kinds of equal opportunity. I mean, it says if you're extremely homely and you don't have charm, intelligence, wit, or any of the qualities that might be ameliorating for that homeliness, you're out of luck. I mean, you're really, and that was very troubling to my students, because they wanted to think that looks don't matter, haha. I mean, any of those things, mm-hmm. and the book is quite clear about the extent to which they do matter, and it's part of the darkness and part of the beauty and part of the heartbreaking. I mean, it just is a killer to read, because it's so beautiful and it's so sad, and this is their lives. I mean, these are the lives of these three people, and they're never going to be any different.
It's also, in some sense, too, I mean, the whole detail of its being in 1899 a part of Hungary that's no longer part of Hungary, it's also a whole way of living that has, in some sense, gone. And in part, the book suggests good riddance, because, I mean, it talked about a town where, all the men died of cirrhosis of the liver, and the curious thing is, it is very sad, and I had forgotten, it's in this context that how much weeping goes on in this book. I mean, Skylark gets on the train at the beginning and dissolves in tears for the entire course, but it's also very funny.
That's also very funny. You know, one thing I noticed this time is that they go to this play, and I'm pretty sure that it's the same play that Gusev and Anna go to in Lady with the Pet Dog. I mean, I think, you know, it's a pretty accurate, I think, picture of what dreary provincial life in Eastern Europe was during that time.
Mm-hmm.
So that play, which is, you know, there are little quotes from the play, and it's just appalling. I mean, just off, you know, it's about, I don't know, Asian people or something. I mean, it's awful, but that's their big entertainment. That's their, you know, they just can't believe that so much culture has suddenly become theirs in the short time just because Skylark isn't there.
Yeah, well, sort of a vaudeville Madame Butterfly, but
exactly,
they put on, and so there is a whole thread which about, there is a figure who I think is meant to be the author, who is woven in at the center, and a sort of and a kind of effort to who will tell us about him a bit. There's this
the idealistic journalist, the sort of disappointed journalist who's kind of flittering around the edges of this community life that the men have, and who doesn't fit in with the others in the way because Kosztolányi grew up in a town very much like this awful dead-end, dusty middle of nowhere, and managed to escape. And the journalist, as so often happens with writers, I think, he's written in his nightmare of what his life could have been if it hadn't turned out the way it had. Yeah,
well, he's a sort of pathetic poet and so on. But he makes a jotting one day. He sees them. He runs into the two parents and makes I think it says he jotted in his notebook, Skylark's parents, or at dusk, or maybe it's seeing them at the end. Remember this, and as if this is a real detail. And so on. Peter Esterhazy in his introduction sort of says, I mean, Skylark is in a way a kind of symbol, but an interesting symbol, and in that she's very hard to pin down what she is exactly. Do you have? And he has a sort of say, who's Skylark, and that. Well, Skylark it's the most inappropriate name in literature that I can. Right. I mean, you know, and also very cleverly, you don't find out. I mean, Skylark, you think somehow it's this kind of lovely young girl, Skylark. I mean, what the name suggests, and it takes you really a while to figure out simple things like how old she is, for example. Yeah. I mean, you think maybe she's a teenager and she's doing her embroidery or whatever when the book starts, and then little by little you realize she's on the cusp of middle age. And again, it's part of the sadness of it. I mean, here's this woman named Skylark who's never going to get married, you know, the dream, who's just going to live with her parents until they die and then go on living, presumably. So, and she's very mysterious, although she's capable, I mean, she's capable of sending her parents a letter in which she essentially lies about everything that's happened to her on her little vacation and is pretending to have a great time. And then only later you find out how miserable she's been and how isolated and alone. So she's not utterly witless, but again, she, like her parents, has been so imprisoned and so deformed, partly by their love for one another, that there's really not much she can do. I mean, love, the whole town and certainly the family exists in a state of mutual non-communication, which curiously is love. And Well, what would they say? What would they say? You know, I mean, if these people were to actually talk, you know, the one time that the father really says all these things, it's unforgivable, and it has to be forgotten as soon as it's, I mean, and also the whole, you know, the family is emblematic of the whole culture. I mean, unless you're completely blind drunk, which the men in the village seem to be, you know, most of the time, you can't say anything. So again, it's, you know, it's interesting to me that all three of us picked books from Eastern Europe asked to talk about a dark time. Yeah. Well, we're there now. Yes, exactly. I think we should try open it up to questions at this point, perhaps. With that.
Yeah. Well, first off, thank you to the three of you for those beautiful readings. I especially appreciated the bird song in the background for Skylark. I think we have time maybe for just one question, but it's a good one. And it's for Francine. Could you could you list some of the books you assigned for that class on strange books?
Yeah, I mean, I did it twice. So there were two different, reading lists. We did Thomas Bernhardt's Woodcutters. We did Jane Bowles's Two Serious Ladies. We did Valser's Jakob von Gunten. We did A High Wind in Jamaica. I mean, I have to say, it was amazing. We did Platonov. We did Soul. How many of the books on the list were New York Review books? I mean, I wasn't getting a commission or anything, but it just happened to be that was the place that had brought these books back into print. We did Bruno Schultz. We did Wallace Shawn's Grasses of a Thousand Colors. Henry Green, we did Loving.
And a question for maybe Boris or Edwin and Phil. Do you know, Nina asks, Grossman makes noble the common man. How is he viewed in Russia today? Is he read by Russians?
Yes, he is read by Russians, but not by all Russians. Although he is on the curriculum as a kind of a selective choice in some school curricula. But he's a favorite of intellectuals, and especially those, I think, in opposition to the regime, and especially for Life and Fate. I don't think that the book that is known in English as Stalingrad, which in Russian is known for A Righteous Cause, is the title of the book, for a just cause. That is still not a well-known book among Russian readers, both in Russia and abroad, and partly because of the things that Phil brought up. It's seen as if it was officially published, it must be compromised. It was seen as a work of propaganda, which of course it really isn't. I should say also in connection with what Francine said, the books that we've chosen, two of them are translated by the team of Robert Chandler and Elizabeth Chandler with assistance from a number of collaborators. And I think that's quite telling. These are excellent translations. And rediscoveries both for Anglophone audiences and for Russians of authors that are, I think, too readily dismissed.
One because he was Soviet, the other because she was an emigre.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And they have more than that in common. Edwin, you asked if I could speak about what they have in common. One thing I'll say, and I see it also in the comments, is Chekhov. Both were great admirers of Chekhov, and especially the democratic impulse in his writing, the desire to feature all Russians, not to stop it at a certain class, not to stop at a certain state or in a certain town, but to really get the picture of what's happening everywhere. And both have a kind of doctorally approach to their characters. They understand the whole person, what ails them and what makes them beautiful.
And also a sort of a touch with detail that sort of enters in from left field. Yeah. There's a wonderful passage in the book where one of the commanders is pretty sure he's about to die, and he's on the phone with the sort of general in charge of the entire fight, and he's sort of explaining his situation, and in the middle of it he hears like a crunching, and he realizes that the general is eating an apple, and then he just goes back to and then there's another pause and he realizes he's like smoking a cigarette. It's just
yes.
Yeah,
it's a gift for detail. Absolutely, sketching in an entire person with one gesture.
Yes.
Yeah.
So you each picked the books you read from. Is that correct? You weren't assigned these books. Were there any close seconds, or was it an easy choice for you to make? The NYRB backlist does have a fair amount of Anguish. Were there any close seconds?
What were there? Actually, there was a book I wished somebody would write about in terms of when I was talking about this and sent, because at one point we were talking also to Anka Mulstein about being involved. And so I sent her Miron Białaszewski's memoir of the Warsaw Uprising, which is an astonishing, I mean, it seems like a you were there sort of account of the Polish uprising against the Nazi occupation, which the Soviets just sort of sat on the other side of the river and watched being crushed. And Białaszewski was about 19 at that point. He's a great Polish poet. But it's also as a narrative, a kind of helter-skelter. I mean, it's an extraordinary piece of narration as well, and which is something that I think is true of, I mean, both the Teffi and the Grossman books. The Grossman books looks conventional in certain ways, but it really is. Anyway, I would have wished that we could have had a chance to talk about that book too. So that, from the editor's point of view, is another one.
I thought of bringing up Omer Pasha-Latis, Ivo Andrik's very strange. I mean, it's not really a novel. It's more like a series of sketches, really intense psychological portraits and scenes, sort of in a decaying, arrogant, blind empire. But you know,
that book
that would have cut a little bit too close to the bone.
Yeah.
I think Edwin and I talked about A High Wind in Jamaica.
And also Ivy Compton Burnett, we talked about a bit too.
We talked about Ivy Compton Burnett.
Yeah.
I kind of wanted to do but you had just talked about High Wind in Jamaica, I think.
We had in one of your.
I kind of wanted to do it because I'd written in the introduction, and my view of the book had changed completely since I wrote the introduction. So I feel like every opportunity, some other time. But yeah.
Well, when we reprint, we can have you revise it. Or your second introduction could be like a Marxist classic. You pile on successive introductions.
Well, I think that might be all we have time for tonight, but this was really, really wonderful. So thank you again to Edwin for organizing it and for letting us host. Thank you, Boris. Thank you, Francine. And thank you, Phil. You can buy any and all of these books from McNally Jackson at McNallyJackson.com. Edwin, are you doing any direct sales yet?
Some. We're doing sort of boxes, book boxes with that. But
also buy direct at NYRB.com and McNallyJackson.com. And just thank you again, everybody, for joining us tonight. This was a lot of fun.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
You. Okay. Bye-bye.
Thank you.